Claire is a lecturer in English language and linguistics in our department. She teaches social linguistics and researches grammatical change in English dialects. And I think she's now ready to present. And her study is a study of grammatical change in the use of never in British English dialects. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Sam, and hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk to you about use of never and grammatical change, as Sam says. And in doing so, I'm going to pick up on a few themes from the A-level syllabus, in particular, language diversity and language change in relation to grammar and semantics and pragmatics. And I'm going to start by reviewing a few key background things to know, which you might have seen already in the pre-workshop talk, but if you haven't viewed that, that's fine. You'll be kept up to speed. So first of all, there's three main types of never. And the first one is perhaps the one you might think of first if you ask what do you mean by the word never. It means not ever or not on any occasion. So this is the one in the left-hand side, type 1. And this refers to possible events over a period of time. So an example would be if speaker A says, didn't your school used to organise a sixth form party every year? Speaker B says, yes, but I never organised it. So here speaker B is meaning that anytime there was a sixth form party, they didn't organise it. And this is originally from Old English, but of course we still use it today. Then there's type 2, which is called window of opportunity never. This means not rather than not ever. And it refers to a single instant event that we can call an achievement that could have taken place within a particular window of opportunity but didn't. And crucially, you're expecting the event to only happen just one time. So for instance, I waited in for the postman, but he never arrived, is an example of that. And this is found in the 17th century and again is still used today. Then the last kind, type 3, is a generic negator that also means not, but rather than type 2 just being restricted to achievements, the generic negator, type 3, can occur with any kind of state or event, so i.e. any sort of sentence type whatsoever. And this is a non-standard use, doesn't have any kind of inherent time reference. So just using a similar example to type 1, but in a different context, we can see an example of this kind. So speaker A said, you were in charge of organising last year's sixth form party, weren't you? Speaker B says, I never organised it last year. And if they say I never organised it last year, just referring to one single party, that is this kind of non-standard use of never. And this one's found from the mid-19th century onwards, but only in particular dialects. So in all likelihood, you probably use definitely type 1, you might use type 2, though some people find it perhaps less common than type 1. Type 3, you might have that as part of your dialect or you might not. And the key thing to take from this is basically that never has undergone diachronic language change, i.e. change over time from meaning not ever to meaning not. So type 1 developed into type 2 and then type 2 developed into type 3, but all three kinds still exist in the language today. So my research was interested in the question, to what extent does variation in the use of never in present-day British English dialects reflect this historical development? And I'll give a brief overview of this in the next slide. I'm getting some comments that say, can I turn the mic up? I think I'm on as high as I can go. Apologies, I'll try and talk a bit louder. I hope it's okay for everybody. So data and methods. Conversations, there were conversations from 3 different archives from Glasgow, Tyneside and Salford. Extracted instances of never and didn't in past tense contexts, both type 2 and type 3. And this is because in this context, never and didn't mean the same thing. So they're equivalent forms in this environment. So I extracted instances of these and categorized them into the different kinds, and then compared the percentage frequency of each form in the type 2 versus the type 3 context, with the aim of seeing whether that newest use, the non-standard kind, is still influenced by its origins in the type 2. So in the pre-workshop talk, I talked about results according to lexical aspect, and I've just got this green box here reminding you what those different categories of lexical aspect were. I also discussed results according to dialects separately. So in this slide, I'm going to show you something different, which is combining the two, because you might be wondering whether the findings are consistent across different dialects of English. So for those of you who haven't seen these categories before, the main distinction I'm going to focus on is the achievements, where an event does not persist over time. So the time of the event is seen as instantaneous, like the verb to hit, for instance. And what we can see, first of all, in terms of dialect differences, is that there's a much higher frequency of never use. This is the non-standard kind in Glasgow compared to Salford and Tyneside. This chimes with existing literature that suggests this is particularly common in Scottish varieties. Why that's the case is not entirely clear, but it might be because of differences in language contact in Scotland, or possibly other differences in the negation system that have been documented. But what we can see also is that in terms of lexical aspect, the non-standard type 3 never is influenced by its origins in the type 2, because remember, type 2 were just achievements only. Type 3 can theoretically occur with any sentence kind, but it's still occurring at the highest frequencies with achievements. And this is consistent across the dialects. So you see the highest percentages for achievements across the board. So we can see here that never's changed from referring to events persisting over time to single instance. And just a methodological point here, when we split data by locality, sometimes it means you end up with less data for certain categories. So that's why activities and accomplishments are missing for Glasgow and Salford in this graph. But it's not just the semantics that differ between the different kinds of never, but also the pragmatic functions. So we have a number of different functions that it can serve, one of which is contradiction, which is explicit denial of another speaker's assertion. So for instance, we have here an example from Glasgow where the first speaker says, "You just done it," and the second speaker says, "No, I never." So they're just contradicting what came before. You can also use it to deny expectations. So with this example from Salford, the person says, "My cousins were supposed to be meeting us at 4 and they didn't turn up till 7. So the equivalent with never would be never turned up till 7. And then lastly, there's a more neutral context where there's no kind of expectation. As we see in this example from Glasgow, first speaker says, "It said in the forecast," speaker 2 said that I never put a washing out. And that's just brand new information, doesn't really deny an expectation. So the differences between the kinds of never are that type 3 never is most likely to be used for contradiction, as in the first example. Type 2 never is not used for that function at all. It's used for the other two. And also we get this interesting effect where examples like the first kind with ellipsis of the verb, i.e. no, I never, instead of no, I never did, or no, I never did it, often have that contradiction function. So we get this clustering of what as linguists we would say a very marked construction, a very non-standard lack of verb, ellipsis of the verb, with a non-standard use of never and a very sort of salient, emphatic contradiction function as well. So the take-home messages from this are that never has undergone semantic and grammatical change, changing from not ever to not. And we can class this as semantic broadening because it's broadening the context of use that it has. It tends to refer to instant achievements, even as it's changed from type 2 to type 3. And it's developed this contradiction function in interaction as well, which is new. So the results show us that linguistic restrictions on the use of words and constructions can persist for a very long time, even when their meanings and contexts of use have changed. And also that the standardness or acceptability of grammatical constructions is really very context dependent. And that's one of the themes that we take up in the activities for this case study on the English Language Toolkit website, which you can see briefly here. So there's tasks about acceptability, categorizing the different kinds of never. But in terms of additional resources, if you have students wanting to do projects on language variation or language change, you might be able to use the questionnaires in the activities and develop those. They ask speakers to give acceptability judgments, but you can use any kinds of sentences you like in there. You don't have to just focus on never, of course. You might be able to adapt them to studies of language attitudes as well. And also, if you're interested in how people actually use language, you might be able to find recordings online, videos, and calculate the frequency of linguistic features in their speech. And also, if you're interested more in the historical aspect of this or any other kinds of grammatical change, you might like to look at dictionaries or prescriptive grammars or online resources like the Oxford English Dictionary to see what they say about words and their use and how this has changed over time.
I'm going to start with a question that was sent in for Claire, one that's been upvoted during the talk. In the pre-reading, Claire, there seemed to be a difference in the use of never in the 3 different places. And to what extent is that evidence of regional variation or synchronic change rather than diachronic change?
Yeah, I mean, with this, there's always a regional element as well. So you're absolutely right. This use of never, this non-standard one in particular, it's been called a vernacular universal of English. It's found in Englishes around the world. Loads of countries, loads of different varieties of English have it. But what seems to be different is the frequency with which it's used. So the Scottish community in my study had it particularly at high frequencies, but also some of the contexts of use differ. So like that elliptical example, no, I never, when it's like that contradiction function, that was very sort of characteristic of some of the Glasgow examples in particular in my study. So it seems that the reason for that might be that some of the historical change in the use of never has progressed sort of further in some dialects than others through various sort of we see these sort of cycles of change, especially with negation, where forms can get this emphatic function and then lose it over time. So that might be the next step, where never seems emphatic now, but it'll gradually become sort of, it could potentially become the new not. Like it might not seem so non-standard in hundreds of years' time.
Great. And a related question that came in from the pre-workshop, which was about the grammatical change in never. It seems like the old usage is the one that's the standard usage, whereas the newest one, the type 3, is the non-standard. And so the question is that the pattern? Is it always the case that older usages tend to be the ones that are more accepted as the standard?
I think it depends. I think you get a lot of cases like that where you get new uses coming in and people notice them and they're noticeably non-standard and people comment on it. But also you get the opposite, where things that used to be part of standard English centuries ago are now seen as non-standard. So for instance, like double negation or negative concord, like I didn't see nobody. That was the sort of default way of expressing I didn't see anybody in Middle English, but nowadays that's seen as non-standard, even though it's a bit like the never, it's used in loads of Englishes around the world, but it's not part of standard English.